Folks, we're going to get going. If you please come and grab your seats, make your way in from the foyer, and we'll keep going.
I'm actually going to
Okay. Awesome. Okay, let's get started, guys. So as you can see, our next panel is all up here and ready. And frankly, since I know them all so well, I think I'll just introduce them myself. Leading this panel is Janet Brown, Alberta's and perhaps the nation's best public opinion pollster. My personal opinion, perhaps the public's. And Sonia, Kont, senior consultant, political organizer, and New West's longest-serving employee, who has been in the trenches with Dad for nearly 6 years. Welcome, Sonia. And my brilliant friend, Scott Crockatt, Vice President, Communications and External Relations at the Business Council of Alberta. And my old friend and my business partner, Keith McLaughlin, who you all got to know earlier today for Lisa's keynote. So without further ado, Janet, take it away. This is all yours.
Nope. Okay. I have the great pleasure. I am going to present some brand new polling data to you. This stuff is being released publicly right here and now, never before seen. Now, before this panel's over, some of the event staff is going to distribute this brochure. It's got all the information in there, so you don't have to madly take notes. And you can take this home and tack it on your bulletin board and hold me to account later. So. So anyway, without further ado, can we get my presentation put up on the big screen? Great, okay. So as I said, we conducted some original research just for this conference, and I'm going to bore you a little bit with methodology because I think it's sort of important for you to know how this data is collected so that you can feel confident about the results. If you even casually follow polling in Alberta, you probably have a sense that polls aren't always very reliable in Alberta. And if it feels that way, it's somewhat true. Alberta is a really tricky place to poll. And I could do a whole presentation on that, but I'll just say that I find that it's been very important to me to be very diligent when it comes to methodology. Because that's really how you get these things right. So just to quickly explain your methodology, so what I do is true random sample. It's not an online panel, it's not a robocall. We hire real live people. They work for a company called Trend Research up in Edmonton. Most of them are students, and they make calls at random. And we talk in a regular sample, we talk to 900 Albertans, a random representative sample of 900 people. When we get somebody on the phone, we give them 3 options. They can answer the survey at that moment, we'll call them back at a more convenient time, or we'll send them a link so they can answer it online. What we're trying to do is make it as easy as possible for people to answer our surveys. And our goal is to try and get the highest response rate possible. And don't get me wrong, it's hard to get a good response rate in polling, but we're trying to get the highest response rate possible because a low response rate, well, you could have a bias there. And polling in Alberta seems to miss a particular type of voter. So we're working really, really hard to make it as easy as possible so that we don't underestimate certain groups of people. So we make these calls, they're live people, they're calling from Edmonton. As soon as somebody answers the phone, they say, "Where are you calling from?" And you have a much better chance of getting people to stay on the line if you say you're calling from Edmonton than if you're calling from Montreal or Bangalore. So the other thing we do is when we call telephone numbers, we call them up to 5 times at 5 different times a day before we give up on them, because we do find that easy to reach people have different views than hard to reach people. So we're doing callbacks, the numbers, we're calling half cell phones, half landlines. We're really doing the most diligent job we can to get the best sample possible. The data I'm going to show you was collected between June 13th and June 21st, so it's pretty new. It's barely a week old. Just to give you some more trust in my methodology, The top set of bars is a poll that I conducted during the 2019 election, and the bottom set of bars is the actual election results from 2019. So I'm very proud to say that we were the only polling company, thank you. I'm very proud to say we were the only polling company that got all 4 parties within our stated margin of error, which was plus or minus 3%. But not only did we get that at the provincial level, we also got it at the local level, Calgary, Edmonton, others. So a little bit of bragging, but I just want to give you some faith in the data that I'm about to show you, okay? So essentially I've got like 3 different questions we asked. And the first question I want to talk about is a completely open-ended question that we asked people. So we didn't give them any categories. We just said to them, what do you think are the most important issues affecting Alberta today? Okay? To keep the suspense going a little bit longer, I'm actually going to show you some old data before I show you the new data. So this is a question I ask a lot, this open-ended question. Start the survey, no bias, just what's on people's minds. So we asked this question in 2015, just around the time of the 2015 election, when the NDP won a majority government. And when we asked that question in 2015, the top answers we got from people were healthcare, education, and then the economy and needing a new getting a new government and that sort of thing. But you'll see, you all know how word clouds work, right? The biggest word are the ones that were mentioned most often. So in 2015, when Albertans elected a majority NDP government, they were primarily concerned about social programs like healthcare and education, and the economy was more of a secondary concern for them, okay? That's the Alberta that elected the NDP. Now, fast forward to 2019, this is a poll we did around the time of that election, and you can see that the big concerns were, employment, the economy, the energy sector, right? Does that sound familiar? Jobs, economy, pipelines. That's, the UCP won that election because they were speaking exactly to what Albertans cared about at that time. So when we were socially focused, we elected the NDP. When we were economically focused, we elected the UCP. What are we focused on today? I think based on the conversation we had earlier today, this next one's not going to surprise you. Okay, this is what has people preoccupied in 2022. Inflation. That was by far the #1 answer. So, inflation included things like cost of living and cost of gasoline and those sorts of things. Healthcare is still a strong concern, but it's a secondary concern. Education is up there, energy's up there, homelessness, environment, economy, poor government. Now, let's play Where's Waldo? It's there, but can anybody see autonomy? Can anybody see freedom? Can anybody see sovereignty? So when I put this word cloud together, I sort of laughed because I thought, wow, this does not in any way, shape, or form reflect the kind of debate that's happening in the UCP leadership vote right now. So perhaps the panel could talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so that was the first question I asked, most important issue facing the province. Here's just another, for those of you who are more sort of, for the engineers in the room, here's a line graph. Top answers in 2015, healthcare and education. Top answers in 2019, jobs, economy, pipelines, more or less. And then here's the top answers today, right? So 41% of people, we allowed people to give us multiple mentions, but 41% of people, that's a huge number in a question like this, mentioned that inflation was their #1 concern, okay? All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is another question where we ask people to think about their political orientation on a left-right spectrum. So we say, rate yourself from 0 to 10, where 0 means you're very left-wing, and 10 means you're very right-wing. And it's a question that academics love. They use it all the time. And one of the great things about that question is, funny enough, most people can do a pretty good job putting themselves on that spectrum. And the numbers are pretty consistent. So we just like to ask that question just to remind ourselves, like the stereotype is Alberta's a very right-wing province. Is the reality that we're as right-wing as the data says we are? And so here's what I got this most recent time when I asked the question, right? So we have this stereotype in Alberta that we're a very right-wing province. But actually, sort of the #1 answer people give is, the most common answer is people say they're a 5 out of 10. I mean, people consider, a large number of Albertans consider themselves to be centrist. And when they answer other questions in the questionnaire, we find out, yeah, they are pretty centrist. Now, among those who are sort of further out on the spectrum, more people are likely to call themselves right-wing than left-wing. But when I look at this graph, I think the stereotype is we're a hugely right-wing province, but I think the reality is we're a centrist province that just kind of leans to the right, okay? I will tell you, though, I said this question's fairly consistent when I ask it survey after survey. In this last survey, the Calgary number was exactly what I expected it to be. The Edmonton numbers were what I expected them to be. The rest of Alberta turned out to be more right-wing than they typically are. So that's going to be a pattern I watch for. Coming out of COVID, has the rest of Alberta sort of taken a stronger swing to the right, okay? These are smoothing curves, but basically what I wanted to show you was the orange curve kind of represents where NDP voters fall in the map. Green is, so orange is likely NDP voters, green is likely Alberta Party voters, dark blue is likely UCP voters, and the red is people who say they'd vote, they're likely voters of the Wild Rose Independence Party. So you can see that, of course, which party you're going to vote for is you're sort of more or less on the spectrum. But you know, we can't lose sight of the fact that most people live pretty near the middle of the spectrum, okay? Now, the final question I want to present to you is a question on likelihood of vote. Now, the question that pollsters love is, if an election were held today, what party would you vote for? Great question, but even at the best of times, that question is very hypothetical. So I just didn't feel it made sense to be asking that particular question right now while the UCP didn't have a permanent leader. So instead, I asked a question where I presented 4 parties, and I said, in the upcoming election in 2023, how likely are you to consider voting for these parties? So what I'm trying to find is the available vote for all of the parties, right? You follow me? So here's the answers. So the first bar is the UCP. The dark part, 26%. 26% of Albertans say they are very likely to consider voting for the UCP in the next election. And then another 26% say they're at least somewhat likely. I add that up to 52%, and I would say that, you know, the universe of vote, the available vote for the UCP right now is at 52%. After the struggles the UCP has had in recent months, this has got to be good news to them. And remember from the graph I showed you before, the UCP got 55% of the vote in the last election. So their available vote is back up to 52%. So what that says to me is, now that they're looking for a new leader, like they've won back almost their entire voter base is now back in the camp of at least being willing to consider the UCP going forward. The NDP, their available vote is not quite as high, it's at 39%. But as Ian Brody said this morning, remember he said everybody's sort of going for a 37, 38% win. Well, a 39% available vote, you know, does in theory put the NDP in a place where they could form government if they could win over that entire voter base. The other thing I'd mention is that when you're talking about a hypothetical leader, it's probably easier to give them a higher score than an actual leader. So I would say both of these parties are very competitive right now, and it's too early to call what's going to happen in this next election. Then we've got the Wild Rose Independence Party. They've got full voter availability is 25%. The Alberta Party, we've got 24% saying they're at least somewhat likely to consider that party. Just show you how it breaks down. Oh, and the other question, after we presented the 4 parties, we said, are there any other parties on your consideration list? And 7% of people said they would consider the Alberta Liberal Party, and 2% said the Green Party. No other party had even registered at 1%, okay? This is that same graph, but that just shows you how it breaks down in Calgary, so very similar to the provincial average. Here's Edmonton, though. The NDP have a clear edge in Edmonton, and here's the rest of the province. NDP's not doing so well there, but the UCP's doing really well, okay? I'm going to leave you with another piece of information. This isn't from the poll that I'm just releasing right now. This actually comes from the Define the Decade survey that I did for the Business Council of Alberta. In your tote bags, you got an executive summary of that report. I'm proud to say I worked on this research as well. But I just kind of wanted to show you this graph because we asked people on an open-ended basis what they desired in, what the Alberta they desired in the year 2030. And, you know, the number one thing they said is they wanted to be prosperous, they wanted us to have an improved economy, they wanted us to have a better government. And in that research, and Scott can talk more about it, but one of our big conclusions was Albertans are very like-minded in what they want the future to look like, a little bit divided on how they think we're going to get there. Okay, this is the graph the thing I already showed you, but I just wanted to leave with this is what's on the minds of Albertans right now, and it's the party that best addresses this that's going to be best situated for the coming election. Okay, so I've taken a little bit of time. I think we've still got about a half hour. I'm going to sit down and we're going to go to questions. And then is this mic on now?
Not yet,
Not yet.
but it will be.
And then if you guys could turn this mic on. Any minute now? Anyway, they're handing out the little folders with the polling information. So as I said, you can take that home and tack it up in your bulletin board and call me if I turn out to be wrong a week from now. Great. Okay, so we're going to have a discussion, and I'm supposed to be the moderator, but I'm going to leave it pretty open. But I'm just going to this is the question reporters always ask me. I hate it. So I'm going to ask you guys. The question reporters always ask me is like, oh, so you did a poll. What, if anything, in that poll surprised you? So, what you guys, they got a preview, so do you want to start, Scott?
Yeah, sure, I'll take a crack at that. And Janet, it's always a pleasure to hear from the Oracle of Inglewood, as I refer to you as. And Janet and I have worked together for, probably closing in on 20 years now. And something that you may or may not have known about me is for a long time, I was a drummer in second-rate Alberta bands. And so I'm very familiar with playing the opening act for the headliner, but you know, following after Mark Carney is somewhat less familiar to me in my second-rate drummer experience. I'll tell you what surprised me, and maybe a little bit that didn't surprise me as well. I was surprised actually at how high the inflation number was. I wasn't surprised that inflation came up number one, but that trend has come on so fast in Alberta. You know, we were talking before. I think if you had asked Albertans even 1 quarter ago that we would have had, that inflation bar would have been almost invisible. And it's just shot to the number one issue. We're hearing about it all over the place. It's a big concern for businesses as well. You know, I'm the nonpartisan guy on this panel, so I'm just sort of here to represent what we're hearing from Albertans and businesses generally. But that one has shot up very, very quickly. But it also didn't surprise me entirely when I was looking at some of the economics numbers, that actually Albertans are feeling the effects of inflation more than any other province. If you were to add how much wages have gone up in the last year and then subtract inflation down, Albertans are almost 8% poorer than they were a year ago, and that's worse than any other province. So there's the surprise and the not surprise.
And you know, I'll say, I didn't show you the data, but I asked a similar question during COVID, and at 41% of people saying they're concerned about inflation, like that's on par with the number of people who said they were concerned about COVID in 2000, right? So
that level of a priority,
that level of priority. So, Sonia?
Awesome. Well, thanks, Janet. Always a pleasure. Well, I'll start with what didn't surprise me, and that was the question about inflation. I think that's impacting everybody, not just in Alberta, but across the world. And I think that's going to be a key issue for Albertans coming into the next election and probably many years moving forward. And I think that's going to be something that both the opposition, the UCP, and the other parties will have to kind of address. That's something that hits real hard to people, whether you live in the city or in rural Alberta. Of course, as a conservative, as a UCP member, I'm happy to see the numbers as it is today. In 2019, I believe Jason Kenney got 55%, so kind of in line with the 52%. But I think that's several factors for that. I think the biggest factor is how the government of Alberta has handled the economy. We saw, I think, the Minister of Finance, Jason Nixon, announced that our surplus was, I think, $4 billion. And I think that's great heading into the next election. I think that's a good record for the UCP. You know, we can talk about all the investments the government has done in different sectors like tech, agricultural, carbon capture, hydrogen, etc. And you know, UCP speaking, I think they've accomplished what they said from the beginning. You know, you got to give credit to Jason Kenney, like him or not. He's accomplished, I think, 90% of his platform promises that he ran on in 2019. That being said, I think Rachel Notley is still a very competitive, she runs a very competitive party, and I think the UCP will really need to work hard at, you know, trying to keep the ship together, unite, and not let this kind of get to them. I think it's a real opportunity for the UCP and kind of a wake-up call for them. You know, they have a real opportunity here to kind of move ahead towards the next election, but they are their biggest enemy moving forwards.
Right. Keith?
You know, I think what's most surprising to me about their data, this wasn't actually shared in your presentation, but it's actually the inaccessible vote. The folks that are saying that I'm not going to consider voting for this party. And there's some numbers here that I'll share with you. 43% of Albertans under Janet's data say that they will not consider voting for the NDP. And 29% say that they are not at all likely, I guess I should use your terminology, not at all likely to vote for the UCP. So that's actually a really high number for the NDP and much lower of a number than you might suspect for the UCP, given for how many years have we, you know, since they took government, they spent the first couple of years fighting with constituent groups, teachers, doctors, outdoors enthusiasts, people in the eastern slopes. Don't chuckle, this is all factual. And yet still only 30% of Albertans are not at all considering to vote for them, which I think would be interesting because you wouldn't suspect that given what we've seen about how many kind of groups they've, you know, made a little bit upset. And then you wouldn't expect that because on the inverse with the NDP, 43% of folks just saying, I'm not going to consider voting for them at all. So that's a concerning dynamic for the NDP, an encouraging dynamic for Sonia. She's very happy with all this data. And so, but that to me was the biggest surprise. Most of everything else made a lot of sense, but that would be one of my biggest surprises.
Yeah, and so I think it speaks to how much a leader defines a party, right? And as I said, they don't know who the leader of the UCP is going to be, right? So it's easier to imagine that, well, you know, there's some people in the race I don't know, you know, I'm keeping my mind open because I may like somebody in that race. So, you know, a leader can define a party both positively and negatively. So I think when you're looking at that data, you've got to sort of keep that in mind. It's sort of like that hypothetical versus, you know, and a hypothetical leader is always going to be more important than more liked than you know, than an actual flesh and blood one. So, and you talked about some of that data. You got your little brochure that I've left with you. Also, all of the detailed tables are going to be on my website if you want to follow up. If you're a real nerd, you can just swim through all of this data if you want. So, before we turn to the floor, I mean, sort of the next question, I mean, Scott, you're sort of on the stage representing the business community, and Sonia, you're a well-known UCP supporter, and Keith has cut his teeth in NDP politics. So, you know, Scott, I'll start with you. Like, what does this say for the business community? What do you, now that you've seen this data, what kind of advice, when you get on the phone tomorrow, what are you going to be telling your members? And then I'll ask you guys to think about the political side of things.
Yeah, I think I'd tell the same thing to my members and to any political party that's seeking success in the province, which is, and you started to mention it, that as we got Albertans to look further and further out, and we, you know, this is research that's hot off the presses, but you and I recently did some, as you pointed to, that asked Albertans what they want kind of 10 years in the future. For all the talk of division in Alberta today, and there are real divisions, we're actually remarkably united on the type of province that we describe wanting in the future. And I think that to me was a headline finding. You know, there's more that unites us than pulls us apart. And Albertans are likely to describe, you know, you showed the word cloud, but we'd say, you know, a province that's a place of belonging, where everyone belongs, a place of opportunity, doesn't matter where you came from or what your last name is, and a place of solutions, you know, the kind of place that can solve the next challenge the way that we solved getting oil out of sand and that kind of thing. And so I actually think the message for business leaders and political leaders and anyone who's sort of planning policy is to say, whoever can align themselves with that future for the province is likely to be successful and is likely to be rewarded for it. It's almost like a little bit of a treasure map. And that's actually something that I literally have been telling businesses and business leaders that if you're talking that way about the way that Albertans want in the future, you'll be rewarded for it too. And one of the ways that businesses see that is trust in business increases. And today lots of panelists have talked a lot about declining trust in institutions, which is absolutely a thing. But interestingly, in Alberta, over the course of the pandemic, business trust has actually increased somewhat as they've sort of aligned themselves to some of those long-term objectives for Albertans.
Right.
So that's what I'll tell them.
Yeah, and I've done some of that research, and we have seen that, like, as trust in so many groups and institutions have gone down, Albertans still place a high amount of trust in Alberta business. Yeah. So, as she was talking, I thought, like, oh, COVID divided us, but maybe inflation will unite us.
Inflation will unite us. If that's what has to do it, then yeah. I've heard that. Albertans are hungry to be united, actually. Looking for less fighting, less blaming between levels of government, more uniting. I think that'll reap rewards.
Okay. So just to change the order, let's go to Keith first, and then I'll end with you, Sonia. So Keith, now you see these numbers, like what are the lessons for the NDP? What would your advice to them be?
I think they have to think about what some of the lessons might be, because it's a concerning sort of numbers here. I just talked about the high number of the folks who are not going to consider voting for you, but you've also got a low floor and a low ceiling. So under this poll, you mentioned, the NDP could potentially win an election with 39% of the vote. That would take sweeping Edmonton and Calgary, or having the votiest of vote splits that ever did vote split in a lot of other areas. So, it doesn't seem too great, but there's, I think, some of the issues we can get into as well, but I guess a few caveats, right? Alberta politics is fluid. Janet, you have on your proprietary stuff, they've been bouncing around back and forth with lead changes, and we're talking about the horse race. We're still a little ways away from the election. So it's just one poll, it's one snapshot in time. The second bit is that, you mentioned this in your presentation, but the UCP leadership race is becoming captivated by things that don't matter to Albertans, most Albertans. This idea of personal freedoms and rights, relitigating COVID, sovereignty, these are all very, very low on the issues. And so, if that leadership race moves down that path and keeps talking past Albertans, and whoever wins it, makes a bunch of commitments on that, there's going to be a lot of room for the NDP to grow there, especially if it is, Danielle Smith. I think that, the NDP is being compared against an imaginary premier, and, the most popular premier is the one you conjure up in your mind, and I think that's where voters are at right now with a bit of the UCP. So those are all kind of things that I would say are things to keep in focus if you're thinking about lessons. One lesson, though, I think there needs to be is that you already won healthcare and education as issues. You need to offer something more. You need to offer something more on affordability. You need to offer something more on energy and economy. And I know they're working hard on that, and it's hard to punch through in this environment. But anybody who votes NDP already knows that they're voting for healthcare, voting for education. Where are you getting the next batch of voters from? Where can you captivate people, especially if a UCP leadership race ends up with a party that is much further to the right, talking about things that Albertans aren't talking about. To Scott's point, talk about the things that Albertans want to be talked about.
Yeah, my advice to the NDP is, remind people about, the cap on insurance being removed. Remind them about the cap on electricity being removed. Remind them that, hey, on top of everything else, you're also paying this much more for those caps that were lifted. So, my advice would be, the NDP is not often seen as the party of the economy, but try and own inflation, because, like I said, the UCP leadership candidates, they're off on some other topics. Sonia, do you want to talk about the...
Sure. Well, the first thing that I got out of that poll, Janet, with the UCP kind of leading towards the next election, and I know it's just a snapshot, but I think it gives some hope for Alberta Conservatives in this province. They've had a tremendously difficult 2 years with caucus revolt. You know, we've had a leader resign. Now we're headed towards a very competitive and probably a very ugly upcoming leadership race. I'm hoping it's not ugly, but that's just me. But what it does give, you know, you ask people what they care about the most, what concerns them, that's affordability. And I think the UCP can do a good job if they say it on message on giving solutions and policies on affordability. They own the economy conversation. They've done a great job. You know, today, like I said, we have $4 billion in surplus. So whoever the next leader is, he or she, they're going to have to come up with good policies addressing that issue. And I do agree with you, Janet. I don't think the biggest issue in people's minds, including conservatives, whether they're in rural or urban, is freedom, it's inflation, it's affordability, it's, you know, about that farmer considering how he's going to pay his input costs, which has tripled, or a single mom in Calgary or Edmonton that's figuring out how they're going to pay their groceries or their energy bill, etc. So I think it's a real opportunity for the Conservatives to think about, you know, the 1 million voters that got them elected in 2019 are going to probably give them a second chance. But again, if they stay on message, they stay united, and talk about the issues that really matter to the general public.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then maybe we'll try and go to the floor if there's time. So one of the things, so I write this quarterly report. You were talking about my graphs going up and down, my proprietary graphs. So I wrote this report called Wild Ride, and I do it in partnership with Paul McLaughlin, who's a journalist up in the press gallery. And every year, Paul and I look at each other and we think, does the title still work? I'm like, yeah, it still works. But one of the things, I changed my methodology for how I measured voting intention in my proprietary stuff about a year and a half ago, because I really became focused on orphan voters, right? Like because what was happening is I was running polls and I was getting these really high numbers for the Alberta Party. And I'm like, well, they don't, and at that time, they've got a leader now, he's here, but at that time they didn't have a leader, and it's like, how could this party be doing so well? And then at the same time, other pollsters, like Angus Reid, for instance, was getting these really high numbers for the Wild Rose Independence Party. And then it occurred to me, like, I have a group of people who answer my survey just kind of like, I don't know, put me down for the Alberta Party. And, you know, in an Angus Reid survey, I don't know, put me down for the Wild Rose Independence Party. So I started to really track these orphans. And what I've been finding in my own polling is that when you ask what people how they're going to, the way I ask the question is, are you going to vote for the UCP, the NDP, or for another party? And about a third of voters will say, I'm going to vote for somebody else. And then I ask them, well, who are you going to vote for? Half of them will name a party, the Alberta Party or the Wild Rose Independence. And the other half will say, I don't know, I'm going to vote. They're not a truly undecided voter. I'm going to vote, but I'm homeless right now. So sorry for that long introduction, but there were two other parties on that poll, the Alberta Party, the Wild Rose Independence. There's a whole bunch of other registered parties other than that. Do you all just want to kind of make a comment on those orphan voters, those other voters? And number one, do you have any advice for those parties? Do you have any predictions about what's going to happen with those? Like, is it going to translate into low voter turnout, or like, Scott, what do you think the future of these orphans are?
So I think that the answer to that is probably found in one of the other things I found most interesting in the poll, which was the priorities of Albertans, actually. And you know, you flashed up what the priorities of Albertans were in the 2015 election, then you flashed up what the priority, you know, which leaned towards healthcare and education, the more social side of things. Then you showed what they were in the 2019 election, leaned towards the more economic. I think that we're headed into a period where the policy priorities are both. And you know, if you looked at those sort of top 5 issues that people were bringing up, I think 2 were on the social side, 2 were on the more economic side, and you could probably say inflation is both. It's cost of living and it's an economic issue. So I think the question will be, you know, people won't necessarily be voting for the traditional party that they were imagining. The question will be, who can actually do both those things at once. And with my business hat on just for 2 seconds, I think this is a big challenge that a lot of businesses are wrestling with as well, because the old way used to be Milton Friedman, the business of business is business, make some money, and that's all you need to worry about. And many businesses now are realizing, no, I'm going to have to do both these things. I'm going to have to walk and chew gum. I'm going to have to deliver business and social. And I think the same is going to be true to find, to win the hearts of Albertans who feel orphaned at the moment.
Right, right.
Sure, I'll answer that. Well, I think it's really interesting to see how politics kind of has been going the last 10 years. I've been involved for a very long time. You look at the NDP and the UCP, they're very different in many ways. You look at the UCP, very economy focused. They'll talk about policies that talk about school choice, families, cutting red tape to promote investment and businesses coming in. And you look at the NDP on the other side, who are very focused on social issues, and they're very good at messaging on that. And I think what my advice for the other two parties, you look at the Wildrose Independence Party, and their base is really focused in rural Alberta, in my opinion. And I think they stand for a few things, and I'm not sure if they're gonna go beyond that. I don't know if their base is gonna go beyond that. For the Alberta Party, I think people are trying to figure out still what they actually stand for, right? They're seen as a centrist party, but I think they have to come up with a bit more bolder policy or bolder stance on things that they think that Albertans care about. So it's just that it's kind of like American politics in Alberta a bit. You have kind of the right wing and then the left wing, and the center kind of gets lost because there's a lot of noise on both sides.
Great. Keith, you want to weigh in on this?
I'm sorry in advance, Barry.
He's warming up.
Barry Morchita is the leader of the Alberta Party, and I like you, Barry, so this isn't against you. We've been talking about the Alberta Party for 10 years, right? What I see in this data is the same thing that we've seen for a long time, which is when they're dissatisfied with the Conservative Party and not in love with the NDP, they park their preference in between elections with the Alberta Party. However, you don't see the other things that go into generating political momentum. We do not see the fundraising. I believe last year the Alberta Party got outraised by the Pro-Life Coalition, which I don't even think runs candidates.
No, I don't think so.
But regardless, so there's not as much party activists and all these other things. So it's got a great brand, right? Barry, maybe you can captivate the province with a bold vision, but I think when it comes to the Alberta Party, I will believe it when I see it, and what I see is in between elections, this always happens. As for the Independence Party, I don't know, I think it's a little bit harder to have a hard done by attitude and blame Ottawa for everything when you're going to be swimming in a $15 billion surplus in 6 months. Right. Although, the UCP leadership race could be won by someone more moderate, and that could, propel a defection of some sort to the Wildrose Independence Party, and they could perhaps win a seat somewhere. But the only prediction that I was willing to make about the 2019 election, aside a UCP victory, but was there would be two parties represented in the legislature. I'm not ready to go that far just yet about next year, but if you had to put a gun to my head today, I'd say there would be two parties represented in the legislature again.
Good. Okay, we have just a little over 5 minutes. Is there any questions? Graham's there with the microphone. Any? No questions for the pollster?
Barry, would you like to make a statement about how I've wrong?
Anything?
Yeah.
Okay, okay. Well, I mean, we can keep going. What I would say, so one of the lines that I've been using a lot is that, here in Alberta, we effectively have a two-party system, right? Like Dwayne Bratt's there, he can tell you the political science definition of what an effective two-party system is. Oh, is there a question over there? Is that you, Linda? Yeah, okay, we'll get the microphone to you while I finish my comments. We effectively have this two-party system, but when you look at the data and you see that big line for people who rate themselves as 5, we've got this two-party system, but I do think we have this multi-party electorate. But at the same time, like I've got these people I focus on who I call the orphan voters, but they're also like the orphan voters in a coma, right? Like there's this whole category of voters out there. And so when I think back sort of 15 years ago, the people who were the stalwarts of the Progressive Conservative Party, right? And I don't want to name any names because they'll get mad at me, but I have so many friends that were so active in the Progressive Conservative Party 15 years ago, and they are on the sidelines. They don't want to talk to me about politics. They don't want to think about politics. So I think that's sort of one of the problems is you've got a whole bunch of people in the middle who want to vote for a centrist party, but for some reason we don't have a lot of people who want to work to make that happen, to donate, to get involved. And yeah, so we have comatose orphans. That's the phrase I'm going to take out of this thing. So.
Linda Johnson, former MLA in Calgary Glenmore. In the 2015 election, I was tied on election night and lost by 6 votes.
Right.
So my question is voter turnout, which ties into your COMA voters. Have you been paying attention to that? Because that's some of what happened in 2015. People stayed home. They weren't willing to come vote. So can you share some background on that?
Well, and that's, well, I'll answer the question. Maybe the others will have something to say too. But that's what conservatives do, right? Like conservatives aren't so much vote switchers, but when they're not satisfied, they stay home. And when you've got a two-party system, you don't really have a second choice vote. And then I look at the Ontario election, right? And what low voter turnout that there was there. So, and then the other thing I'd say is, we've got this big inflation. Inflation's the big issue, but no parties are doing an effective job talking about that. So fast forward 1 year, if inflation's still the issue and nobody thinks either party has the answer for inflation, I'm sad to say, but I think, I don't like making predictions, but I'd probably predict low voter turnout if things go on the same trajectory. Any of you guys?
Yeah, I would also agree, Janet. I think when there's a big appetite for change, there's going to be a big voter turnout.
Right.
If everything's kind of blah, and people don't know, especially the conservatives, they stay home, they keep their votes back.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I think one thing that I've heard, through the work that we've done together, and we've done surveys across the province. We've recently come off of doing focus groups in a whole bunch of communities, even hard to reach communities and rural First Nations and that sort of thing. And there's a palpable sense of frustration with politics. And anytime I'm talking to anyone in government or any politicians about this, I often say, like, it's not pointed at anyone in particular, and that's not a criticism of you, that a lot of Albertans are just sort of frustrated by the way that politics has been working lately. They see different levels of government, as I was saying, sort of pointing fingers at each other. They don't see cohesion between municipal, provincial, and federal. I think that does have a cooling effect on overall voter turnout. And I think my encouragement in that direction would be, paint the vision of the future where this province is a better place under your ideas, right? Not just why the other people are bad.
Sorry, the time on the clock changed. What?
I guess we have 12 minutes.
Got a little more time.
Oh, is it? We've got more time.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's alchemy.
Okay. Oh, there's our. Oh, I kept. Oh, so Heather was sitting next to me through this whole thing, and she's like, and I'm like, Heather, ask a question. Now she asks a question when I'm standing
Well,
here.
the last time I didn't get a chance, and they cut off the time.
Oh, okay.
So Janet, my dear neighbor and the pollster of pollsters, and I didn't know that you were the Inglewood Oracle, but
The Oracle of Inglewood. Right?
Oracle of Inglewood. Okay, so I will actually, maybe put a sign up on my back gate for that next time you're doing a media hit.
Heather puts a lot of political signs up at election time. Yeah.
You do a lot of polling, both municipally and federally, and then, of course, your specialization provincially. Are there things that we learned from the provincial, from the federal election, and then the municipal elections that we just held last fall that influence or can speak to what we might anticipate coming into a potential, well, for sure an Alberta election by May, but maybe earlier?
So what I would go to is I'd go to that 0 to 10 graph, right? And the number of people who were in the center. And because we had so many, and so I'm going to think mainly about Calgary politics, because we had so many people running for mayor, because there were so many contested seats, people were able to sort of vote according to their kind of more centrist values. People are always vote more left-wing the closer you get to home, right? Like, you know, everybody's always surprised that conservative candidates lose the Calgary mayoralty race, but they always do, right? Because we're more likely to vote progressive the closer to home we are, but also with it's hard to compare municipal politics to provincial politics because of the party system, right? The lack of party system at the local level. So I guess that's how I'd answer that question. Yeah, and then federally the same, right? Although, you know, here in Alberta, you know, we overwhelmingly vote conservative at the national level, but that's, as I said, we always vote, you know, we're more conservative the further we are from home, the more progressive we are closer to home. So, yeah. Great. Yeah, go ahead.
Janet, I've been talking to a lot of Albertans, and there's a lot of what I would call Alberta alienation towards Ottawa and Ottawa's treatment of Alberta. What does your polling say about how parties might activate this feeling of alienation using the anti-Ottawa kind of thing? I mean, you said there's no appetite for freedom and sovereignty, but I know within the business community and even amongst my neighbors, they're tired of the way Alberta's being treated by Ottawa. How do they activate that and bring, what does your research say that around activating those feelings towards bringing people to your party?
Gee, that's a complicated question. So, you know, the question that we asked for this polling was, what's the most important issue facing Alberta? If I had read a list of 20 issues and said, please tell me if this is or is not important, you know, the word cloud would have looked a bit different. So I think the important thing to keep in mind is that actually the fight with Ottawa, it may be top of mind for certain politicians, and it may be top of mind for a segment of voters, but it's not top of mind for a wide swath of Albertans. But that doesn't mean that we aren't unhappy with the federal government, right? You just have to look at how Albertans voted in the federal election. Although the Conservative vote dropped and dropped pretty substantially in this last election, it's still, you know, a majority of Albertans vote Conservative, so we are frustrated. I guess to that I would say, and this is based more on kind of the stuff I pick up from the qualitative research I do rather than the quantitative research, is, you know, we're mad at Ottawa, but what most Albertans are looking for is a better deal, not a bigger fight. And I think we've had a government that it's been all about the fight, and this is one of the reasons that Albertans got so frustrated with the provincial government, is they were like all about the fight, and we were like, well, we want the fight to end in a good outcome. And so, you know, when I look at these numbers and I look at the number of people who are now open to voting to the UCP and how much that greater that was than just a couple of months ago, I think what people are saying is that, you know, and Sonia, you know, you were saying you think, you know, Jason Kenney, you know, accomplished 90% of what he set out to do, and, you know, I'm not going to disagree with that. What Albertans got frustrated with was the tone and how it was being done, and so I think there's a whole bunch of UCP members and Albertans in general who were saying, like, you know, I'm okay with the things this government was doing. I want a new leader who's going to set a new tone, and, you know, is going to just. Sorry, I don't want to get overly. I mean, I'm a pollster, so I'll get political. But you know, if I were to show you tracking data that goes back to the time of the last election, this government really started to lose its way before the pandemic, and it was with kind of the, you know, the launch of the war room and things like that, and just and pipeline projects not going ahead and stuff, and people were saying, like, you know, we elected you to fight, we elected you to stand up for us, but it's like you just seem to want to, you seem to want the fight to continue, and that, I think, and, you know, childcare is kind of a good example of that one, right? Like, I think Albertans, just like all Canadians, wanted a deal on childcare. And it was frustrating even to, it was frustrating even to moderate voters that government seemed to just take so long because of sort of politics. So,
yeah, no, I'll pick up on one little part of that I wanted to think about a little bit. You know, Western alienation is real, and it's, it's palpable, and you can feel it. You talked about activating it, though. I think the way that, at least I'm interested in, a lot of Albertans are interested in activating it, is to figure out how we can make Canada work better. There's two broad ways that you can motivate people and rally them together. You can do common enemy, or you can do common vision. And common enemy is easier, but common vision is more powerful in the long run. And I think the moment we're at in Alberta is actually one where people are more interested in common vision than they are in common enemy.
There's a question us pollsters love to ask, and it's like, do you think of yourself more as an Albertan or more of a Canadian, right? And pollsters, so when you ask a question like that in Quebec, most Quebecers say they think of themselves first and foremost as a Quebecer. When you ask that question anywhere other than, than any other province other than Alberta, the most people say I'm both, people say I'm Canadian, right? In Alberta, it's almost a perfect balance between people who say they're Albertan Canadian or both. So, we have a stronger sense of sort of provincial identity, but that sense of provincial identity is not so strong that we, and this is where I think the fight for autonomy and sovereignty and stuff like that, we don't want to, polls will say most Albertans don't want to separate from Canada. They want a better deal in Canada, right? We want to go for marriage counseling. We don't want to go for divorce counseling. Yeah.
Well, just on that issue, Janet, of Western alienation that Gord, my colleague, mentioned, if you just look at just the UCP membership itself and the race going on, I think the reason that particular candidate is really pushing that is people are still talking about it. She's obviously running for the leadership of that of the party, not so much about thinking ahead of the next election. And your polling suggested when you think about freedom, it's very low on the list, but inflation is. So I think in terms of talking about the fight with Ottawa, it'll be really interesting to see where all these candidates bring their ideas on the third year panel, which Jason Kenney kind of struck during the last, I think, 2 years or so. There's talks about, the Alberta pension plan. There's talks about the Alberta police force. And I think I saw today that a bunch of municipalities are not on board with that. So it'll be really interesting to see those kind of Ottawa-Alberta issues face up ahead of this leadership race, and certainly ahead of the next election.
Yeah, the other thing is I'm talking about polling that I did with the general public. Well, of the 900 people I talked to, maybe a handful of them are going to participate in the leadership race, maybe a few more, but not a lot, right? So it's the difference between what do these candidates need to do to win the leadership. And I have no doubt that, I think we're talking about Danielle Smith, I have no doubt that Danielle Smith is talking to a ton of people who care about sovereignty. But that doesn't mean she's talking to a representative sample of Albertans, and it doesn't mean that, that could absolutely be her winning formula for becoming leader of the UCP, but it will not set her up well in the general election. So I heard Ron Leipert, the MP from Calgary West, he was on the Eye Opener a few months ago, and he said something. He was sort of saying to his federal conservative associates, he was saying, don't govern by your inbox. The people who call you and write to you, they are not representative of the population as a whole. So, so I see a lot of campaigns, and you get in an echo chamber, you hear the same thing over and over again. It's easy to think, I do presentations all the time, and people go, I don't know about that, Janet. I was at dinner the other night, and nobody agreed with what you're saying. So, I have no doubt the majority of people they're talking to are saying those things, but those are niche issues.
Yeah. I wanted to pick up on priorities of Albertans a little bit, because you'd brought it up, and the need for solutions. So you flashed up the word cloud of what Albertans are worried about today, and inflation is right there in the absolute center of that. I think that's actually a more complicated issue than that shows, because the reality is Albertans are feeling very broke at the moment, right? Their cost of living has gone up, but the solutions don't feel like solutions, right? Like we'll solve inflation, we'll just raise interest rates. Well, that costs Albertans who have mortgages more money each month. So that doesn't really feel like a solution.
Or you gave me a CERB check, give me an inflation check, right?
and
Oh,
then
that'll help inflation
yeah,
if we all get a
sometimes
check.
well, that's actually going to make it worse.
Yeah.
Neither of those things feel like solutions. So I think Albertans are really interested in that sort of short-term solutions to that. And then you threw up the long-term one, where the word prosperous came up like loud in the center of it. But I think as you pull that further apart, the first instinct may be to think prosperity means economy, which it does, but I think Albertans are now more likely to define prosperity with a whole basket of other things thrown into prosperity as well. Things like healthy life, a good healthcare system, even like a beautiful natural environment is part of having a prosperous.
Well, and that's why people have to read the Define the Decade report, because it really did get into the complexities of what prosperity means for Alberta. And when I had the very first meeting with you and Adam Legg, Adam essentially said, like, I want to know what prosperity means, right? Like that was like one of the original meetings we had on Define the Decade was, and so the report really does get into how I remember when I moved to Alberta, I was a downtown Toronto girl, and my friend, are you moving? Why would you move to a place like Alberta where all anybody cares about is money, right? And it's like, no, that's not Alberta.
Yeah.
That's
Come here. It's not actually like that.
yeah,
Come meet us.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I think we've run over time, so thank you very much, everybody. Yeah. Are you gonna? Oh. You tell everybody what's happening.
That was fantastic. Thanks so much, Janet. That was really great. We always love seeing data at these things, and that was as fresh of data as it comes. You guys were the first to see it. It's obviously now online. And as I'll say again, if you want to comment online, use our Alberta Relaunch hashtag. We were trending actually just before they came on, like 6th in the country, even ahead of the new Barbie movie. So that's got to mean something, right? So we're going to take one last 10-minute break to reset the stage for our final panel. So please feel free to stretch your legs, but do not go too far. The West of Center podcast from CBC, for the first time ever on this very stage, is taping their weekly podcast live in front of all of you. Obviously, we've seen the discussions today. There's definitely no shortage of things for our very talented podcast panel to talk about. So take a quick leg stretch and be back for a 4 p.m. start. That's just under 10 minutes. See you soon.